Margaret Chen shopping alone at an upscale mall, dressed in simple clothes. Teenage troublemakers begin harassing her, demanding money, and blocking her path. Security guards ignore her pleas for help, dismissing her as unimportant. The teens escalate to physical intimidation. What they don't know is that her son David is a highly trained private security specialist who has protected world leaders and billionaires. The revelation and consequences will leave everyone speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Chen pushed through the gleaming glass doors of Grandview Luxury Mall. Her worn canvas shoes silent against the polished marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. At 72, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world quietly, her small frame wrapped in a faded navy cardigan that had seen better decades and comfortable gray slacks that bore the soft wrinkles of frequent washing. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun secured with a plain elastic band, and she carried a modest black purse that looked almost apologetic against the backdrop of designer storefronts and luxury boutiques that lined the mall's pristine corridors. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the massive skylights illuminated the stark contrast between Margaret's humble appearance and the opulent surroundings, where everything gleamed with the promise of exclusivity and wealth. She had come here for a simple purpose: to buy a birthday gift for her granddaughter at one of the few stores that carried the specific toy her granddaughter had mentioned. But as she walked past displays of $1,000 handbags and jewelry that cost more than most people's monthly salary, she felt the familiar weight of not quite belonging in such spaces. Near the central fountain where water danced in choreographed patterns around sculptures that probably cost more than her annual pension, a group of 5 teenagers had claimed the surrounding benches as their territory. Tyler Morrison, 17 and tall for his age, sat at the center of the group like a self-appointed king, his designer hoodie and expensive sneakers marking him as someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His blonde hair was styled with the kind of casual perfection that required expensive products and regular salon visits, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned early that intimidation was a useful tool. The other 4 clustered around him, a mix of boys and girls who wore their affluence like armor, their laughter sharp and predatory as they surveyed the passing shoppers with the bored cruelty of those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. They had been coming to this mall for months, turning it into their personal playground where they tested the boundaries of what they could get away with. And today, as Margaret Chen walked past their fountain kingdom with her humble clothes and careful steps, Tyler's eyes lit up with the particular gleam of someone who had just found their next source of entertainment. Tyler nudged his closest friend Marcus with his elbow, a smirk spreading across his face as he watched Margaret Chen approach their section of the mall, her simple appearance standing out like a target against the luxury backdrop that surrounded them. "Look at this," Tyler said loud enough for his entire group to hear, his voice carrying the particular cruelty that only privileged teenagers seem to master. "Looks like someone got lost on their way to the thrift store." The laughter that erupted from his companions was sharp and immediate, the kind of pack mentality that fed on itself and grew stronger with each cruel observation, and Margaret could feel their eyes on her as she tried to maintain her dignified pace toward the toy store that was still 3 storefronts away. "Hey, Grandma," called out Jessica, a blonde girl with perfectly manicured nails and a voice that dripped with false sweetness. "Did you know this is a luxury mall, not a charity shop?" The group dissolved into more laughter, and Tyler stood up from his bench with the lazy confidence of someone who had never been challenged, and his expensive sneakers squeaking against the marble as he positioned himself to get a better look at Margaret's reaction. "Seriously, though," Tyler continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical as he played to his audience, "those clothes look like they came from 1970, and what is that smell? Is that mothballs or just old age?" Margaret's hands tightened slightly on her purse strap, but she kept her eyes forward and continued walking, her decades of experience having taught her that engaging with bullies only encouraged them, though she could feel the familiar sting of humiliation beginning to burn in her chest. Marcus, emboldened by Tyler's performance and the approving laughter of their friends, decided to join in with his own contribution to the mockery. "My grandma dresses better than that, and she's been dead for 3 years," which sent the entire group into hysterics that echoed off the polished surfaces around them, the sound bouncing between the expensive storefronts like a cascade of cruelty that seemed to fill the entire corridor. Other shoppers began to notice the commotion, some slowing their pace to watch the spectacle unfold, while others quickened their steps to avoid becoming involved, and Margaret realized with growing dread that she was becoming the center of a very public humiliation in a place where she already felt like an outsider. Her simple desire to buy a birthday gift for her granddaughter now overshadowed by the casual cruelty of teenagers who saw her vulnerability as their entertainment. Tyler's confidence swelled as he watched Margaret continue her determined walk toward the toy store, her refusal to acknowledge their taunts only fueling his desire to push the boundaries further, and with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, he stepped directly into her path, blocking her route with his tall frame while his friends formed a loose semicircle behind him like a pack of wolves sensing weakness. "Hold up there, Grandma," Tyler said with mock politeness, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers who were now openly staring at the unfolding confrontation. "I think you might be confused about how things work around here." Margaret stopped walking and looked up at the teenager towering over her, her weathered hands still gripping her purse strap as she maintained her composure despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach, and she could see the predatory gleam in his pale blue eyes that told her this situation was about to get much worse. "You see," Tyler continued, gesturing grandly at the opulent surroundings with one hand while keeping the other casually in his hoodie pocket, "this is what we call a premium shopping environment. And there's a certain standard that needs to be maintained here, which means there's a fee for people who don't quite fit the aesthetic." Jessica giggled from behind him and added, "It's like a mall tax for people who bring down the property values just by being here," while Marcus nodded seriously, as if they were discussing actual municipal policy rather than teenage extortion. Tyler's smile grew wider as he extended his palm toward Margaret, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a particularly slow child. "So, here's how it works. You give us whatever cash you have in that sad little purse of yours, and we'll let you finish your shopping trip without any more unpleasant interruptions." The other teenagers moved closer, their designer clothes and expensive accessories creating an intimidating wall of privilege around the elderly woman, and Margaret could feel her heart racing as she realized that what had started as verbal harassment was now escalating into something much more serious. "I don't think you understand," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "I'm just here to buy a gift for my granddaughter, and I haven't done anything wrong." Tyler's expression shifted from mock friendliness to open annoyance, his teenage entitlement flaring at being challenged by someone he clearly considered beneath him. "Listen, lady, this isn't a negotiation, it's just how things work here. So why don't you make this easy on everyone and hand over the cash before we have to get unpleasant about it?" The commotion around the fountain had grown loud enough to catch the attention of 2 mall security guards who approached with the weary expressions of men who dealt with minor disturbances on a daily basis, their polyester uniforms stretched tight over middle-aged frames that suggested more time spent sitting at security desks than actually providing protection to shoppers. Officer Rick Daniels, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a permanent scowl etched into his features, walked with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had long ago stopped caring about his job beyond collecting his paycheck, while his partner, Officer Mike Torres, followed slightly behind, already pulling out his small notebook as if he were preparing to document another routine incident that would be forgotten by the end of his shift. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Daniels asked in a tone that suggested he had already decided this was much ado about nothing, his small eyes taking in the scene before him and immediately focusing on Margaret as the most likely source of trouble, her humble appearance marking her as someone who probably didn't belong in such an upscale establishment. Margaret turned toward the security guards with visible relief, her voice trembling slightly as she explained, "These young people are demanding money from me and won't let me pass. They're calling it a mall tax and blocking my way to the store where I need to shop. Tyler immediately shifted into a different persona, his face transforming from predatory smugness to innocent confusion as he addressed the security guards with the practiced ease of someone who had learned early how to manipulate adults. "Officers, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. We were just sitting by the fountain minding our own business when this lady started yelling at us for no reason." The other teenagers nodded in agreement, their expressions matching Tyler's feigned bewilderment. And Jessica even managed to look slightly hurt as she added, "We were just trying to help her find the senior discount stores because she seemed lost. And then she got really aggressive with us." Officer Daniels looked back and forth between the well-dressed teenagers and the elderly woman in her faded cardigan, his years of experience having taught him to trust appearances over substance. And the obvious wealth displayed by Tyler's group made them seem like the more credible witnesses in his mind. "Ma'am," Officer Daniels said with barely concealed impatience, "these seem like nice kids from good families. Maybe you misunderstood what they were saying. Sometimes when people get to a certain age, they can misinterpret friendly conversation as something more threatening than it actually is." Margaret stared at the security guard in disbelief, her faith in the system beginning to crumble as she realized that her word meant nothing compared to the expensive clothes and confident demeanor of her tormentors. While Tyler suppressed a smile behind his hand, knowing that his family's reputation in this community would always shield him from consequences. The sound of clicking heels against marble announced the arrival of Amanda Sterling, the mall manager, whose perfectly tailored navy suit and platinum blonde hair styled in an immaculate bob projected the kind of polished professionalism that came with managing one of the most exclusive shopping centers in the city. At 45, Amanda had built her career on maintaining the pristine reputation of Grandview Luxury Mall, and she approached the growing crowd around the fountain with the calculated efficiency of someone whose primary concern was minimizing disruption to the shopping experience of her high-paying clientele. "Officers, what exactly is happening here?" Amanda asked in a crisp voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her questions answered immediately. Her sharp green eyes, quickly assessing the situation, and immediately noting the stark contrast between the well-dressed teenagers who looked like the children of her mall's target demographic and the elderly woman whose humble appearance seemed wildly out of place among the luxury storefronts. Officer Daniels straightened slightly, recognizing the need to present a professional front to his supervisor's supervisor. "Ms. Sterling, we have a minor situation here where this elderly lady seems to have misunderstood some friendly conversation from these young shoppers and is making accusations that don't seem to have any basis in reality." Amanda's gaze settled on Margaret with the kind of cool assessment that retail managers used when evaluating potential problems, and she could immediately see that this woman's presence was creating exactly the kind of scene that drove away the affluent customers who made Grandview Mall profitable. "I see," Amanda said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for difficult customers who needed to be managed rather than served. "And what exactly are you claiming happened here, Mrs.?" She paused expectantly, waiting for Margaret to provide her name while simultaneously conveying that she considered this entire situation beneath her attention. Margaret felt the weight of three authority figures looking at her with barely concealed skepticism, their body language making it clear that they had already decided she was the problem that needed to be solved. "My name is Margaret Chen, and these teenagers demanded money from me, called it a mall tax, and refused to let me pass when I tried to continue shopping for my granddaughter's birthday present." Amanda's expression grew even more condescending as she processed this information, her professional smile never wavering but her eyes growing colder. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sure you can understand that Grandview Mall caters to a very specific clientele, and sometimes visitors who aren't familiar with our atmosphere can feel overwhelmed or intimidated by the energy of our younger shoppers who are simply enjoying their time here." The teenagers exchanged knowing glances, recognizing that they had found powerful allies in the mall's authority structure, while Margaret realized, with growing horror, that her age, appearance, and social status had made her the villain in a story where the real perpetrators were being protected by the very people who should have been ensuring her safety. Tyler's confidence reached dangerous new heights as he watched the mall manager and security guards dismiss Margaret's complaints, their obvious bias in favor of his group, giving him the sense that he was untouchable and could push this situation as far as he wanted without facing any real consequences. "You know what, Mrs. Chen?" Tyler said, his voice dripping with mock concern as he stepped closer to the elderly woman. "Maybe you should take the hint that you don't really belong in a place like this, and it would be better for everyone if you just went back to wherever it is you came from." Margaret clutched her small shopping bag containing the few items she had already purchased, her knuckles white as she tried to maintain her dignity in the face of escalating aggression. But she could see the predatory gleam growing brighter in Tyler's eyes as he fed off the implicit support he was receiving from the authority figures who should have been protecting her. "I have every right to shop here," Margaret said firmly, her voice growing stronger despite the fear coursing through her veins. "And I'm not leaving until I buy my granddaughter's birthday present, regardless of what you or anyone else thinks about my appearance." Tyler's face darkened at this display of defiance from someone he considered beneath him, and, without warning, he placed both hands on Margaret's shoulders and gave her a hard shove backwards, the sudden force catching the 72-year-old woman completely off guard and sending her stumbling backward with her arms windmilling frantically as she tried to maintain her balance. The shopping bag flew from Margaret's grasp, its contents scattering across the polished marble floor as she fought to stay upright, her small frame no match for the strength of the much larger teenager who had attacked her without provocation, and the sound of her purchases hitting the ground echoed through the corridor like gunshots in the sudden silence that followed Tyler's assault. Margaret managed to catch herself against a nearby planter before she fell completely, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she stared at Tyler with a mixture of shock and disbelief, unable to process that someone would actually put their hands on her in such a public place with security guards and a mall manager standing just a few feet away. The other teenagers immediately began creating their alibi, with Jessica calling out in feigned alarm, "Oh my God, she just tripped and fell. Tyler was just trying to help her," while Marcus added, "Yeah. She must have lost her balance. Good thing Tyler was there to try to catch her." Officer Daniels looked at the scattered items on the floor and then at Margaret's shaken expression, but instead of seeing an elderly woman who had just been physically assaulted by a teenager, he saw what appeared to be confirmation of his earlier assessment that this woman was simply clumsy and confused, creating problems where none existed. The physical assault on Margaret had occurred in full view of dozens of other shoppers who filled the central corridor of Grandview Luxury Mall, their expensive handbags and designer clothing marking them as the affluent clientele that the mall catered to. Yet their responses to witnessing an elderly woman being shoved by a teenager revealed the moral bankruptcy that often accompanied privilege and comfort. Mrs. Seven Fortame. Chapter 1 by E.J. Patricia Westfield. A wealthy socialite in her 50s who was carrying $3,000 worth of purchases from the jewelry store, looked up from her phone just long enough to see Margaret struggling to maintain her balance. But instead of offering assistance or calling for help, she simply quickened her pace toward the exit, while muttering under her breath about how the mall's standards were clearly declining if they were allowing such disturbances. A group of college-aged women who had been browsing the luxury makeup counter nearby pulled out their smartphones the moment they realized something dramatic was happening, their fingers moving quickly across their screens as they began recording the confrontation with the kind of eager excitement that social media had trained them to feel whenever they encountered potential viral content. "Oh my God, did you see that?" whispered one of the young women to her friend, while keeping her phone trained on Margaret as she bent down to collect her scattered belongings. "This is going to get so many likes." An old lady causing drama at the fancy mall. The businessman in the expensive suit who had been walking past the fountain when Tyler shoved. Margaret simply adjusted his tie and continued his conversation on his Bluetooth headset, treating the assault as nothing more than background noise that wasn't worth interrupting his important call, even though he had a clear view of everything that happened and could have served as a credible witness to the teenager's criminal behavior. A mother pushing a stroller with her toddler actually steered further away from the commotion when she saw Margaret on her hands and knees trying to gather her purchases, her primary concern being to shield her child from what she perceived as an unsavory situation, rather than recognizing that she was witnessing an injustice that demanded intervention. The security guard stationed near the department store entrance looked directly at the scene unfolding by the fountain. But when he saw that Officers Daniels and Torres were already there along with the mall manager, he made the conscious decision that it wasn't his problem to solve and returned his attention to checking receipts from shoppers leaving with their purchases. Even the elderly man sitting on a bench just 20 feet away from the confrontation. Someone who should have felt natural sympathy for Margaret's plight, given their similar age, simply folded his newspaper more tightly and pretended to be absorbed in reading while the woman who could have been his wife or sister was being humiliated and assaulted by teenagers who were young enough to be his grandchildren. Despite the humiliation of being physically assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses who had chosen indifference over intervention, Margaret Chen slowly straightened herself with the quiet dignity that had carried her through 7 decades of life's challenges. Her weathered hands smoothing down her cardigan as she gathered her scattered belongings with methodical precision that spoke to a lifetime of maintaining composure in the face of adversity. Her silver hair had come slightly loose from its simple bun during the altercation, but she tucked the wayward strands behind her ears with the same careful attention to propriety that had been instilled in her by parents who had taught her that grace under pressure was the mark of true character, even when the world around you seemed determined to strip away your dignity piece by piece. Margaret's dark eyes, though bright with unshed tears of frustration and hurt, remained steady as she looked directly at Tyler and his group of enablers, her voice quiet but clear as she spoke, with the kind of calm authority that came from someone who had faced far greater challenges than spoiled teenagers and ineffective security guards. "I think it's time for me to call my son for a ride home," Margaret said simply, her words carrying no trace of anger or vindication. Just the practical matter-of-fact tone of someone making a reasonable decision in an unreasonable situation, though there was something in the way she said it that suggested this was not a surrender but rather a strategic retreat. She reached into her modest black purse with steady hands, pulling out an older model smartphone that looked almost ancient compared to the latest devices that Tyler and his friends were using to record their continued harassment. But she handled it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had adapted to technology out of necessity rather than enthusiasm. The teenagers continued their mocking commentary as Margaret scrolled through her contacts, with Jessica commenting loudly about how pathetic it was that an old lady needed her son to come rescue her from a simple conversation, while Marcus added that her son was probably just as much of a loser as she was if he was willing to drive all the way to the mall just because mommy couldn't handle being around normal teenagers. Tyler leaned against the fountain with supreme confidence. His expensive sneakers crossed casually as he watched Margaret with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had successfully intimidated another victim into submission, completely unaware that the phone call she was about to make would transform him from predator to prey in ways he could never have imagined. Amanda Sterling and the security guards remained nearby, their body language suggesting they were simply waiting for this unpleasant situation to resolve itself so they could return to their normal duties, none of them recognizing that Margaret's calm demeanor and measured response indicated someone who was far from defeated and might possess resources they had not considered. Tyler's laughter grew more cruel and theatrical as he watched Margaret holding her phone, and he gestured to his friends with the exaggerated movements of someone performing for an audience, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the surrounding area could hear his next round of mockery. "Oh, this is rich," Tyler announced, spreading his arms wide like a ringmaster introducing the next act in a circus. "Grandma thinks her son is going to come save her from the big bad teenagers who hurt her feelings by existing in the same space as her." The other members of his group immediately picked up on his cue and began building on the narrative he was creating, with Jessica clasping her hands together in mock concern and speaking in a baby voice. "Oh, does the little old lady need her big strong son to come protect her from some kids who were just trying to have a conversation?" Marcus joined in with his own contribution, his tone dripping with false sympathy as he shook his head sadly. "I bet her son is just as pathetic as she is. Probably some middle-aged loser who still lives in his mom's basement and drives a beat-up minivan because he can't afford anything better." Tyler's confidence reached new heights as he fed off his friend's encouragement, and he began pacing back and forth in front of Margaret like a predator circling wounded prey, his voice taking on the sing-song quality of a playground bully who had found the perfect target for his cruelty. Tyler continued, pointing at Margaret's phone with theatrical contempt. "Your son is some unemployed nobody who's going to show up here in 20 minutes. Take one look at us and realize he's way out of his league before apologizing for his crazy mother and dragging you home like the embarrassment you are." The teenagers erupted in laughter at this prediction, and Jessica added her own embellishment to the fantasy. Or maybe he won't even answer the phone because he's tired of dealing with his senile mother, who calls him every time she gets confused about where she is or what's happening around her. The college students who had been recording the confrontation on their phones moved closer to capture these new developments, their excitement growing as they realized they were documenting what appeared to be an escalating confrontation that would make for perfect social media content. Amanda Sterling and the security guards continued to stand by passively, their inaction serving as tacit approval for the teenagers' behavior, and Tyler interpreted their silence as confirmation that he could push this situation as far as he wanted without facing any meaningful consequences. "Face it, lady," Tyler said with finality, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his privileged life. "Whatever loser you're calling isn't going to be able to help you here, because this is our territory and we make the rules. So you might as well hang up that phone and accept that you picked the wrong place to cause trouble." Amanda Sterling's patience finally reached its breaking point as she watched the situation continue to escalate around the fountain, her carefully maintained professional composure beginning to crack under the pressure of managing what she perceived as a public relations nightmare that was threatening the refined atmosphere she worked so hard to cultivate at Grandview Luxury Mall. The sight of other shoppers slowing down to record the confrontation on their phones filled her with the kind of corporate dread that came from knowing that negative publicity could spread across social media within hours, potentially damaging the mall's reputation among the wealthy clientele who expected their shopping experience to be free from such unseemly disturbances. "Mrs. Chen," Amanda said, her voice taking on the sharp edge of authority that she typically reserved for dealing with uncooperative vendors or problematic tenants, "I think it's time for you to accept that this situation has gotten completely out of hand, and your continued presence here is creating exactly the kind of disruption that makes our other customers uncomfortable." Margaret looked up from her phone with genuine surprise, in her weathered features showing confusion as she tried to process how she had somehow become the villain in a situation where she was clearly the victim. But Amanda's expression remained cold and determined as she prepared to exercise the full weight of her managerial authority. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately," Amanda continued, her tone growing more officious with each word as she fell back on the corporate policies that gave her the power to remove anyone she deemed detrimental to the shopping environment. "And if you refuse to comply with this request, I'll be forced to have security escort you out and ban you from returning to Grandview Mall in the future." The teenagers watched this development with barely contained glee, their faces lighting up with the satisfaction of seeing their victim being punished by the very authorities who should have been protecting her, and Tyler actually applauded slowly, as if he were watching a particularly entertaining performance. Officer Daniels nodded approvingly at Amanda's decision, and his relief, evident as he realized that removing Margaret would solve his problem without requiring him to investigate the teenager's behavior or challenge the assumptions he had made based on their respective appearances. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that not only had the mall's security failed to protect her from harassment and assault, but now the management was actively punishing her for being the target of that abuse, creating a surreal situation where the criminals were being protected while the victim was being criminalized for having the audacity to seek help. The atmosphere in the central corridor shifted dramatically as the sound of purposeful footsteps echoed across the marble floor, and every head turned toward the main entrance, where a tall figure in an impeccably tailored black suit was walking toward the fountain with the kind of measured precision that spoke of military training and professional discipline. David Chen stood 6 feet 3 inches tall with broad shoulders that filled out his simple but expensive suit perfectly. His dark hair cut short in a style that suggested both professionalism and practicality, and his movement across the polished floor carried the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to read environments and assess threats with a single glance. At 38 years old, David possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from protecting some of the most powerful people in the world, his dark eyes scanning the scene before him with the analytical precision of someone trained to identify danger and neutralize it before it could escalate into something more serious. The teenagers near the fountain fell silent as they watched this imposing figure approach, their teenage bravado suddenly feeling inadequate in the presence of someone who radiated the kind of authority that had nothing to do with designer clothes or family connections and everything to do with competence earned through years of high-stakes professional situations. David's suit was clearly expensive but understated, the kind of garment that spoke to quality rather than flash, and his black leather shoes moved soundlessly across the marble as he closed the distance between himself and the group gathered around his mother with the steady inevitability of someone who had never failed to complete a mission. Amanda Sterling found herself straightening unconsciously as this new presence entered her domain, her corporate instincts recognizing someone who carried himself with the kind of quiet power that usually belonged to the ultra-wealthy clients whose protection details she occasionally encountered during VIP shopping events, though she couldn't immediately place where this man fit into the current situation. The security guards also shifted their posture as David approached, their years of experience in law enforcement and security making them automatically aware that they were in the presence of someone whose training far exceeded their own, even though they couldn't yet understand why this professionally dressed stranger was walking directly toward their minor disturbance with such focused intensity. Margaret looked up from her phone to see her son approaching, and for the first time since the harassment began, a small smile touched the corners of her mouth as she realized that the cavalry was arriving in the form of someone who possessed both the skills and the authority to address this situation in ways that these bullies and incompetent security guards could never have anticipated. David Chen came to a stop approximately 10 feet from the group gathered around the fountain, his trained eyes conducting a rapid but thorough assessment of the scene before him with a kind of systematic precision that had been drilled into him during years of protecting high-value targets in unpredictable environments. His gaze moved methodically from person to person, cataloging body language, positioning, and threat levels with the automatic efficiency of someone whose survival had once depended on reading situations correctly within seconds of arrival. And what he saw painted a crystal-clear picture of intimidation, harassment, and institutional failure that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Margaret's disheveled appearance and the scattered items still visible on the floor told him immediately that physical contact had occurred, while the teenagers' aggressive posturing and smug expressions indicated they felt protected and empowered rather than concerned about potential consequences for their behavior. The security guard's passive stance and the mall manager's officious demeanor revealed a system that had failed his mother completely, their body language suggesting they viewed her as the problem rather than the victim, and David's years of experience with corporate security told him that these people had made dangerous assumptions based on appearances rather than facts. Tyler and his friends began to shift uncomfortably under David's steady gaze, their teenage bravado wilting slightly in the face of someone who radiated the kind of quiet menace that had nothing to do with raising his voice or making threats, and everything to do with absolute confidence in his ability to handle whatever situation might develop. "Mom," David said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who had learned to maintain perfect emotional regulation even in the most stressful circumstances. "Are you hurt? Are you hurt?" How times, re-4Ds re-sings 36, Revens please spent. How David said quietly, Henry 3N to the 60H. The simple question hung in the air like a challenge, its implications becoming immediately clear to everyone present, as they realized that this imposing figure was not just a random bystander, but had a direct and personal stake in what had been happening around the fountain. Amanda Sterling felt a cold knot forming in her stomach, as she began to understand that she might have seriously misjudged the situation. While Officer Daniels found himself re-evaluating his earlier assumptions about Margaret's credibility, now that it was clear she had family members who looked nothing like the helpless elderly woman he had dismissed so casually. David's professional training kicked into high gear as he continued his assessment, his mind automatically calculating angles of approach, potential weapons, escape routes, and the physical capabilities of every person in the immediate area, while simultaneously planning his next moves based on what his mother's answer might reveal about the severity of what had occurred in his absence. David reached into his jacket with the smooth, deliberate movement of someone accustomed to being watched by nervous security personnel, and withdrew a leather credential holder that he opened with practiced efficiency before extending it toward Officer Daniels and Amanda Sterling with the kind of calm authority that immediately commanded attention and respect. David Chen, Executive Protection Specialist, licensed by the Department of Homeland Security for presidential and foreign dignitary protection details, he said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute professionalism. Each word delivered with the precise diction of someone who had briefed senators, ambassadors, and Fortune 500 executives on matters of life and death. The credentials he displayed showed not only his federal licensing but also certifications from the International Association for Counterterrorism and Security Professionals, the Executive Protection Institute, and a specialized unit within the Secret Service that most people had never heard of but which carried enormous weight within security and law enforcement circles. Officer Daniels found himself leaning forward to examine the credentials more closely in his years of police experience, telling him immediately that these were not the kind of documents that could be faked or obtained without extensive background checks and the highest levels of security clearance, while Amanda Sterling felt the blood draining from her face as she began to understand the magnitude of the mistake she had made in treating Margaret Chen as a disposable nuisance. I've provided personal protection for 3 sitting United States senators, the Commerce Secretary, the Ambassador to the United Nations, and the Chief Executive Officers of 6 Fortune 100 companies, David continued, his tone remaining perfectly level as he recited credentials that made every person within earshot realize they were dealing with someone whose professional network extended to the highest levels of government and corporate power. The teenagers stood frozen in place. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated as they processed the fact that the loser son they had been mocking was someone who literally risked his life protecting the most powerful people in the world, while Tyler's face had gone completely pale as he began to understand that his family's local influence meant absolutely nothing compared to the federal connections this man possessed. Currently, I'm on a scheduled break between assignments, which is why I was able to respond to my mother's call so quickly, David added, his dark eyes moving deliberately from Amanda Sterling to Officer Daniels to Officer Torres. But I should mention that my current client roster includes the board of directors of the company that owns this shopping center, so I'm quite familiar with their policies regarding customer safety and the treatment of elderly shoppers. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jessica's phone hitting the marble floor as her trembling hands lost their grip, and Amanda Sterling found herself mentally calculating how quickly she could be terminated if David Chen decided to make a single phone call to her corporate headquarters. The full weight of their catastrophic mistake began to dawn on Tyler and his friends as David's credentials sank in, their teenage minds struggling to process the reality that they had been tormenting the mother of someone whose job description included taking bullets for presidents and whose professional network could destroy their families' reputations with a single phone call. Tyler's expensive sneakers suddenly felt like concrete blocks as he realized that every cruel word, every mocking gesture, and especially his physical assault on Margaret, had been committed against someone whose son possessed the kind of power and connections that existed in an entirely different stratosphere from their suburban privilege. Jessica's hands were visibly shaking as she bent down to retrieve her fallen phone, her mind racing through the implications of what would happen when her father, a prominent local attorney, discovered that she had participated in harassing someone with direct connections to federal law enforcement and Fortune 100 corporate boards. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he remembered his earlier comment about David probably being an unemployed loser. The irony of the situation hitting him like a physical blow as he realized he had insulted someone who literally protected the people his own wealthy parents only dreamed of meeting at charity galas and political fundraisers. The other members of their group stood in stunned silence in their designer clothes and expensive accessories, suddenly feeling like costume jewelry compared to the quiet authority radiating from someone who had stood next to world leaders during international crises and had been trusted with protecting lives that were worth billions of dollars to global stability. Tyler's mind raced frantically as he tried to calculate whether his family's connections in local politics and business could possibly shield him from the consequences of physically assaulting the mother of someone who briefed senators and protected ambassadors, and the cold realization that they were completely outmatched in every conceivable way made his knees feel weak. The smartphones that had been recording their harassment of Margaret now felt like evidence of their own stupidity, permanent documentation of their cruelty towards someone whose family possessed the kind of influence that could make their college applications disappear. Their parents' business licenses get mysteriously revoked, or their trust funds suddenly become subject to federal investigation for tax irregularities. Jessica whispered something that might have been an apology, but her voice was so quiet and strangled that no one could make out the words, while Marcus took an involuntary step backward as if physical distance could somehow protect him from the consequences of what they had done. The teenagers who had spent their entire lives believing that their parents' money and social status made them untouchable were now face to face with someone who operated in circles where their family's influence was less significant than the tip money at an expensive restaurant. And the terrifying realization that they had picked a fight they could never win was written clearly across their pale, shocked faces. David pulled out a slim digital recording device and a professional notebook from his jacket pocket, his movements precise and methodical as he activated the recorder with the practiced efficiency of someone who had documented countless security incidents for federal agencies and corporate legal departments. "For the record," David said in the clear, measured tone of someone providing testimony that would later be scrutinized by attorneys and investigators, "today's date is March 15th, 2025. The time is approximately 3:47 p.m., and I am conducting a preliminary incident investigation regarding the harassment and assault of Margaret Chen at Grandview Luxury Mall." He turned his attention first to Tyler, whose face had gone from pale to ashen as he realized that his actions were being documented with the same professional thoroughness typically reserved for threats against heads of state. Tyler Morrison, age 17, son of City Councilman Robert Morrison and real estate developer Linda Morrison. "You are being recorded as the primary aggressor in this incident, including witness testimony that you physically shoved my 72-year-old mother and demanded money from her under the pretense of a mall tax." Tyler opened his mouth to protest, but David continued without pause, his voice maintaining the same professional detachment that he used when briefing protection details about potential threats. "Jessica Hartwell, daughter of Attorney General candidate Patricia Hartwell, Marcus Rodriguez, son of Rodriguez Construction CEO Miguel Rodriguez. Sarah Kim, daughter of State Senator James Kim and Brandon Walsh, son of Police Chief Thomas Walsh. You are all being documented as willing participants in a coordinated harassment campaign against an elderly woman." The teenagers stood frozen as David methodically read out their full names and their parents' positions, the realization that he had somehow identified all of them within minutes of arriving, making it clear that his investigative capabilities extended far beyond what any of them had imagined possible. Amanda Sterling felt her corporate career flashing before her eyes as David turned his attention to her, his tone remaining professionally neutral but somehow managing to convey the weight of institutional failure. "Amanda Sterling, mall manager, employee identification 7749. You are being documented as having threatened to ban the victim from the premises after she reported being physically assaulted, thereby creating a hostile environment that enabled continued harassment." Officer Daniels found himself wishing he had called in sick that day as David's gaze fell on him, the security guard's years of police experience telling him that he was about to be professionally destroyed by someone whose documentation would carry weight in federal court. Officer Rick Daniels, badge number 2158, and Officer Mike Torres, badge number 3097. You are being documented as having dismissed the victim's complaints without investigation and having failed to provide basic protection services that are outlined in your employment contracts and state security licensing requirements. David closed his notebook with the deliberate precision of someone who had just completed the documentation phase of what would soon become a very expensive legal proceeding, and turned his full attention to Amanda Sterling, whose perfectly composed corporate facade was beginning to crack under the weight of understanding exactly how catastrophic her decisions had been. "Ms. Sterling," David said, his voice maintaining the same professional neutrality he used when briefing Fortune 500 executives about security protocols, "I should inform you that my current client roster includes Harrison Development Group, which, as you know, owns this shopping center, along with 47 other commercial properties across the eastern United States." Amanda felt her knees go weak as she processed this information, her years of retail management experience, telling her immediately that David Chen was not making an idle threat, but was instead providing her with critical information about the chain of command that would soon be activated to address her spectacular failure in judgment. Additionally, David continued, consulting his phone with the casual efficiency of someone scrolling through a contact list that read like a directory of American power. I've worked extensively with the corporate security division of Harrison Development Group on multiple projects, including threat assessments for their properties and executive protection for their board of directors during high-risk shareholder meetings. The implications of this revelation hit Amanda like a physical blow as she realized that David Chen wasn't just some random person making empty threats, but was instead someone who had direct professional relationships with the people who had the power to terminate her employment with a single phone call. I'm particularly familiar with Harrison Development Group's liability policies regarding customer safety, David added, his tone taking on the kind of precise legal language that suggested he had reviewed these policies with corporate attorneys who charged more per hour than Amanda made in a month. And I can confirm that your decision to threaten an assault victim with banishment, rather than investigating the reported crime, represents a clear violation of both company policy and basic fiduciary responsibility. Amanda's mind raced frantically as she tried to calculate whether there was any way to salvage her career from this disaster. But David's next words made it clear that the damage was already beyond repair. Given the severity of this incident and the documented negligence of mall security and management, David said, pulling out his phone with the casual gesture of someone about to make a routine business call, I'll be speaking directly with Harrison Development Group's Chief Security Officer within the next few minutes to ensure that this situation receives appropriate corporate attention. The color drained completely from Amanda's face as she realized that within hours, possibly within minutes, her corporate superiors would be reviewing security footage, incident reports, and David Chen's professional assessment of how she had allowed an elderly customer to be harassed, assaulted, and then threatened with banishment for reporting the crime. David shifted his attention to Officers Daniels and Torres with the same methodical precision he brought to identifying security vulnerabilities in federal facilities, and his trained eyes taking in their increasingly nervous body language as they began to understand that their casual dismissal of his mother's complaints was about to be scrutinized by people with the power to end their careers permanently. Officers, David said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had worked alongside Secret Service agents and FBI security specialists, I should inform you that your handling of this incident will be reviewed not only by your direct supervisors, but also by the state licensing board that governs private security operations in commercial facilities. Officer Daniels felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he realized that David Chen's connections extended far beyond corporate boardrooms and into the regulatory agencies that controlled his ability to work in security anywhere in the state. While Officer Torres found himself wishing desperately that he had taken Margaret's complaints seriously instead of making assumptions based on appearances. Your security licenses require you to investigate all reported crimes and provide equal protection services to all customers regardless of their apparent social status, David continued, consulting his notebook with the practiced efficiency of someone who had memorized security regulations across multiple jurisdictions. Yet video surveillance will show that you dismissed my mother's assault complaint without conducting any investigation whatsoever. The implications of this statement hit both security guards like a sledgehammer, as they realized that the mall's extensive camera system had recorded every moment of their negligence, creating permanent evidence that would be impossible to deny or explain away when their supervisors reviewed the footage. Furthermore, David added, his tone taking on the precise legal language that suggested he had consulted with attorneys who specialized in security industry litigation, your failure to provide basic protection services while allowing continued harassment of an elderly customer represents gross negligence that violates both your employment contracts and state regulations governing private security operations. Officer Daniels opened his mouth to offer some kind of explanation or excuse, but David's next words made it clear that the time for damage control had already passed. I'll be forwarding copies of this incident report to the State Security Licensing Board. Your corporate supervisors at Grandview Security Services and the legal department at Harrison Development Group, David said, his matter-of-fact tone making it sound like routine paperwork rather than career-ending documentation, all of whom will be very interested to learn how two licensed security professionals allowed an assault to occur in their presence and then threatened the victim with removal when she sought help. The security guards exchanged desperate glances as they realized that their attempts to avoid paperwork and confrontation had instead created a paper trail that would follow them for the rest of their careers, with David Chen's professional reputation ensuring that their negligence would be taken seriously by every authority figure who reviewed the case. David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts with the methodical efficiency of someone who maintained professional relationships across every level of government and law enforcement, his finger pausing over numbers that would connect him directly to people with the power to make the teenagers' privileged lives very complicated very quickly. "Tyler Morrison," David said, his voice taking on the tone of someone reading from an official document. "Your father, City Councilman Robert Morrison, will be receiving a call within the next 10 minutes regarding your assault of an elderly woman, along with video evidence and witness statements that will be very difficult for his upcoming re-election campaign to explain away." Tyler felt his world collapsing as he realized that his father's political career, which had been built on family values and law and order rhetoric, would be destroyed by footage of his son physically attacking a 72-year-old woman in a public place, while his mother's real estate business would face immediate scrutiny from clients who expected their developers to raise children with basic human decency. "Jessica Hartwell," David continued, moving down his list with the systematic precision of someone executing a carefully planned operation. "Given that your mother, Patricia Hartwell, is currently running for State Attorney General on a platform of protecting vulnerable citizens from crime, I'm sure she'll be fascinated to learn that her daughter participated in intimidating and harassing an elderly woman for the crime of shopping while poor." Jessica's face went completely white as she processed the fact that her mother's political ambitions would be permanently destroyed by her participation in this incident. The irony of an attorney general candidate's daughter committing the exact crimes her mother claimed to oppose, making for the kind of devastating political scandal that ended careers overnight. David's finger moved to the next contact as he addressed Marcus Rodriguez, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the devastating implications of his words. "Marcus, your father Miguel Rodriguez's construction company holds several government contracts that require strict adherence to anti-discrimination and public safety standards, contracts that will be reviewed very carefully when the contracting board learns that his son was involved in targeting elderly customers based on their appearance and economic status." The systematic destruction of their families' reputations continued as David addressed each teenager in turn, his encyclopedic knowledge of their parents' vulnerabilities, making it clear that he had identified the exact pressure points that would cause maximum damage to their privileged positions in society. "Additionally," David said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone who had testified before congressional committees, "I'll be consulting with the district attorney's office about potential charges including assault, conspiracy to commit extortion, elder abuse, and civil rights violations, all of which carry significant penalties for minors who will be tried as adults given the premeditated nature of your actions." The teenagers stood in stunned silence as they realized that their casual cruelty toward Margaret had triggered a chain of consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their college applications, family businesses, and social standing, all hanging in the balance of decisions that would be made by people who measured justice in years of prison time rather than weekend groundings. 6 months after the incident at Grandview Luxury Mall, the ripple effects of that afternoon had transformed not only the lives of everyone involved, but had created systemic changes that extended far beyond the marble corridors where Margaret Chen had been assaulted and humiliated by teenagers who thought their privilege made them untouchable. The mall itself had undergone a complete overhaul of its security protocols under the direct supervision of Harrison Development Group's Corporate Security Division, with new training programs that emphasized customer protection over property protection and mandatory sensitivity training that taught security personnel to recognize and respond to harassment regardless of the apparent social status of the people involved. Amanda Sterling had been terminated within 72 hours of David Chen's phone call to Harrison Development Group, her replacement being a former federal security administrator who implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and established direct reporting lines to corporate headquarters for any incidents involving vulnerable customers. Officer Daniels and Officer Torres had both lost their security licenses after a state investigation confirmed David's documentation of their negligence, with Daniels now working as a night shift security guard at a warehouse facility where his poor judgment could do less damage, while Torres had left the security industry entirely and was attempting to rebuild his career in retail sales. The teenagers had faced consequences that their wealthy parents' influence proved powerless to prevent, with Tyler Morrison spending 4 months in juvenile detention for assault charges that his father's political connections couldn't make disappear, the scandal contributing to Councilman Morrison's crushing defeat in the subsequent election that ended his political career permanently. Jessica Hartwell's mother had withdrawn from the Attorney General race when video footage of her daughter's participation in elder harassment became a centerpiece of her opponent's campaign advertising. The political dynasty that the Hartwell family had spent decades building, crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence of their daughter's cruelty. Marcus Rodriguez had been sentenced to 6 months of community service specifically focused on elder care facilities, where he spent his weekends helping elderly residents with basic tasks while learning firsthand about the dignity and resilience of people he had previously dismissed as worthless, his father's construction company losing several government contracts as promised when the story became public. The most profound transformation had occurred in the teenagers themselves, who had been forced to confront the reality that their actions had real consequences for real people, with court-mandated counseling and community service opening their eyes to perspectives they had never considered during their privileged upbringings. Tyler now volunteered at a senior center every Saturday, his initial resentment gradually giving way to genuine respect for the elderly residents whose stories of survival and perseverance had taught him lessons about strength and character that his expensive private school education had never provided. The story of Margaret Chen's humiliation and vindication at Grandview Luxury Mall serves as a powerful reminder that true character is revealed not by the clothes we wear or the money in our bank accounts, but by how we treat those who appear to have less power than ourselves, and how we respond when we witness injustice happening to people who seem unable to defend themselves against the casual cruelty of those who mistake privilege for superiority. In a world where social media has trained us to judge people within seconds based on their appearance, where wealth and status symbols have become the primary measures of human worth, and where bystanders would rather record suffering than intervene to stop it, Margaret's story reminds us that every person we encounter carries within them a lifetime of experiences, relationships, and hidden strengths that our superficial assessments could never reveal. The teenagers who targeted Margaret made the fundamental error of believing that her simple clothes and modest demeanor meant she was powerless and alone, never imagining that her quiet dignity was the product of decades spent raising a son whose dedication to protecting others had earned him the trust of presidents and ambassadors, whose professional network could reshape their entire world with a single phone call. The security guards and mall manager who dismissed her complaints fell into the same trap, allowing their prejudices about age and appearance to blind them to their basic responsibilities and ultimately destroy their own careers in service of protecting bullies whose sense of entitlement had convinced them they were above the consequences. Perhaps most importantly, the dozens of shoppers who witnessed Margaret's harassment and chose to record it rather than help her represent the moral cowardice that has become endemic in our society, where viral content is valued more than human compassion, and where the comfort of remaining uninvolved takes precedence over the moral obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Margaret Chen's story challenges each of us to examine our own assumptions about the people we encounter, to recognize that true strength often comes disguised as vulnerability, and to understand that in a just world, every elderly person shopping alone should be treated with the same respect and protection we would want for our own grandparents, regardless of whether their children happen to be powerful enough to demand justice. The next time you see someone being mistreated because they appear different or defenseless, remember Margaret Chen and ask yourself whether you will be the person who records the cruelty or the person who stands up to stop it. Because in that moment of decision, you will discover who you really are beneath your own surface appearance.